We now take the discussion further about autism and its prevalence in South Africa. We have in studio Vicky Lemb from Autism SA, and we also have Dr. Wendy Duncan from the South African Society of Psychiatrists. They join me now live in studio. Good afternoon to you, ladies. Thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you.
Now, let's just talk about the prevalence of autism in South Africa. Do we have the numbers really?
Unfortunately, we don't have the numbers. We estimate, and this is based on international prevalence, that it's between 1 to 2% of the population in South Africa. So we're looking at a rough estimate of about 1 million people in South Africa.
South Africa, so it is very much prevalent. Now, I think, Dr. Duncan, a lot of people get confused. How do we know when a child is autistic? Are there signs? Because I think I once read a very interesting article about the disorder many years ago, and someone was saying that it can only be detected when the child is 3 or more.
Okay. So I think, you know, with autism or the autistic spectrum being about a neurodevelopmental disorder, the way the condition looks depends on the age of the child. Okay. And certainly what we know now is we can diagnose the condition quite a bit earlier than even 3. Sometimes even as young as 2, one can have suspicions even prior to that. So how it looks depends on what developmental stage the child is at. In an infant, you may see that the infant doesn't connect, that the infant struggles to sleep, that the infant struggles to feed, that the infant's particularly fractious. When you go into toddlerhood, you're going to see different stuff. You're going to see things like the toddler who maybe is disengaged from his peers in the playground, whose play is possibly atypical or unusual, or the toddler who engages in peculiar or unusual repetitive movements. In times gone by, we used to make a lot of emphasis on language development. And we used to say that you had to have impairments in language development in order to be diagnosed with autism. That's changed somewhat. So the typically understood impairment in language is not a prerequisite. And then going on into the school-age child, then it gets a little bit harder. You know, learning is different. Thinking style is different. Social interaction in particular becomes problematic. And these children often find their social approach is unusual. They may be rebuffed. They don't know how to navigate those engagements. They don't know how to navigate, or it's hard for them to navigate connectedness and relationships. And then again, it depends, I suppose, on the degree to which the individual is on the spectrum. You know, we talk about what previously might have been known as Asperger's disorder or high-functioning autism on the high end of the spectrum, where these individuals are quite neurotypical in many ways, as opposed to the young person who's sort of deeply and classically autistic, where it's actually quite obvious.
It's interesting that you actually made mention of that, because we had a story here just before the conversation of a gentleman who's busy now with his PhD and he's autistic.
I mean, and that's not unusual. You know, and we forget, we make a lot of autism is about children, but in fact these children grow up to become adults. And clearly having a condition like autism doesn't mean that you don't have intellectual capacity. It doesn't mean that you don't have capacity to be actually quite successful. But there will be particular areas in your day-to-day functioning where your condition presents a challenge.
Yeah, and I think challenges can also be, or rather go as far as a lack of facilities that cater for children with autism.
Definitely. You know, in Gauteng, we're relatively lucky. We've got a number of schools and units within special schools that do help us. But within the country as a whole, we really are struggling for services for, as Dr. Duncan said, not just our children, but for what happens when these children leave school. Because autism doesn't stop at the age of 18. We have autistic adults. And so we need services that cover that whole life range, from birth, from the age of 3, from the moment that child is diagnosed, right through to adulthood
But
as
the
well.
question is, why do we still not have such facilities? Here I was saying to you ladies earlier on that we only have these discussions on the 2nd of April every year, and after this nothing happens.
Yes.
So I suppose we need to have more of these discussions often.
Absolutely. It's a very good question. Why don't we have more facilities? Why don't we have more services when our prevalence is so high? We really do need these services and these services to be made available to people.
Yeah. So do all autistic children need special schools, or
No.
can they go to your normal school?
Absolutely. I mean, all autistic children or all children on the spectrum absolutely don't need special schools. What they do need, however, in the mainstream setting is an understanding of their unique needs. So you can be intellectually capable, you can manage your social world. What a mainstream learning environment would need to do is just understand what this young person needs. If they're struggling with their sensory system, how do we help them to manage that? Can they wear some earmuffs? Are there some concessions in their uniform if they can't tolerate the touch of the fabric? What kind of learning support might they need? So they can absolutely function very nicely in a mainstream environment if the environment makes allowances for their uniqueness.
Yeah. And the teachers as well, I suppose they would have to possess that extra knowledge on how to handle them.
And it's very much about expectations. So I think for parents, once they come to terms with a child who's living with a condition, it's about what do we expect from this young person, modifying their expectations. The education system would need to modify their expectations. And so it goes with the communities around the family and around the child as well.
A little later on the show, we will have a conversation with a very young mother with an autistic child and who has had to drop out of tertiary in order to take care of the child. I want to talk to you, Dr. Duncan, about what the parents have to go through. There's an article that I read recently on one of the papers. This mother had to chain the child to a chair in order to try to, protect her from getting hurt. So I suppose it's not just about autistic children, but the parents of all, they also have to bear that brunt.
And I think Vicky will tell you the parents are key. The parents are key. So first it's about coming to terms with what it means to have a child is not going to grow up in accordance with the fantasy that you might have had. So grieving the loss of that child, getting as much education around the condition, being attuned to that individual child and understanding what that individual child needs. And as you've said, many of our parents, because of the lack of support and services, are having to become, their sole focus needs to be their child. Okay, sort of bringing along language in ways that are appropriate for their child, protecting them, addressing neurological and psychiatric co-occurring conditions. Might there be epilepsy? Might there be ADD? So there's a huge burden of care that falls onto parents and families. And coupled with it is the stigma, where people actually would blame the parent and say, well, somehow you must be doing something wrong because this is a very badly behaved child. I mean, if you can imagine a child who is significantly autistic having to use public transport, having to go on a taxi, having to go on a bus. And these day-to-day things that we don't even think about, parents have to confront at each point.
Vicky, quickly, what do you guys do, not on this day, like on a normal base? Because I know that you even have regional offices. So do you even go to your deepest rural areas where education is still needed?
We do. We have a regional officer for most of the provinces in South Africa. And within Gauteng is our head office branch as such, where our main sort of core team is based. And yes, we do. We go into rural areas. We try and create that awareness, that understanding. What's really nice is a lot of our regional officers are also mums. So they are parents. They've gone through the journey. They understand it from a parent perspective, which is really fantastic. And parents can relate to them, which is really nice. So yeah, they go out into regional areas, into rural areas. They talk. They just chat to parents. They try and refer.
It's not witchcraft. It's
exactly
a disorder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then they'll also say, if you're concerned, here is a doctor in this area who may be able to assist you to get that diagnosis. And we don't say that getting that diagnosis is the be all and end all. What we do try and advocate for as well is, if you're concerned, there are certain things that we can already start implementing, and we can still then push for that diagnosis, because getting that diagnosis does open doors.
Yes, indeed. Ladies, time constraints. We have to leave it at this, but thank you so much for coming through. I hope to see more of you in the future, not just on this day, Vicky. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you.
All right, there you have it. Vicky Lamb from Autism SA. We also had Dr. Wendy Duncan from the South African Society of Psychiatrists talking to us about autism and what it is.